Hi everyone. I wanted to take just a minute to, for those of you who weren't able to attend class when we walked through the final case analysis or case presentation, to talk a little bit about some useful things to consider as you're doing that. So I have open here the assignment itself, and then I'm going to be referencing a different case that we used in class to kind of give you some examples of what we'll be looking for. Before we get into the case, I think what I want to highlight is that the first step you need to do in this assignment is to be really clear about the role for social work you're choosing. So you have a case in the assignment that you are given. In that case, there are a number of potential spaces in which social work intervention will be appropriate. And each one of those roles is going to be a little bit different in terms of who your primary client is. So I identify some examples here. There's a father who has a medical condition and disability. There might be some room for medical social work to work, with the father and the family as a related group. There's children in this family who are struggling in school, and so there might be appropriate roles for school social work. There's housing needs, for the mom and the whole family. There's clearly immigration-related needs, and so those are just some examples, but there are many others. Your job is to pick one of those. You're going to kind of envision, here's how I got to know this individual or this family, right? They came into my housing agency looking for support. The child is a child at the school I work at, the father came into the hospital I work at. You're going to envision a particular social work role. And you're going to kind of summarize the case from that perspective. So I'm a medical social worker. The father came in due to his stroke. We worked with him on discharge. And then here's the needs that I see as a result of that role. And that's going to look very different, perhaps, than maybe I'm working with mom relating to housing. She came into our housing agency. Here's what we did. So just knowing and being very clear from the get-go about what the role you're choosing is and how that's going to shape the way you see the case is going to be really important. And I think if you do that really, really strongly, you'll be on a pretty good path to carry the rest of the work forward. So once you do that, then what you're going to do is go through each competency has a required response. And this is what we want you to answer in the paragraphs in that section. So you'll have section 1, use this heading. And then in that section, you're going to respond to anything that you see in here. But you're going to do that for each one from the social work role for involvement that you chose. So if you chose, I'm going to be the school social worker, that's the way you're going to think about all of these different things. If you chose being a community social worker and working perhaps with, an immigrant community in this area, that's the lens through which you're going to understand each of these prompts and each of these sections. So let's use a different case to kind of walk through what that might look like. So this is the case we used in class. Some similar issues that might emerge, but a different family. So again, different case than what you're going to use for your final paper. This is just to give you an example. So in this case, Cesar is a 9-year-old male. His mother's seeking services because he's struggling in school, struggling to complete work, struggling with his attention. He also has intense anxiety at home. He doesn't want to leave the home. He perseverates on a lot of fears and needs a lot of reassurance and support from mom. She's also seeking support for herself because her partner, who Cesar's dad, was recently detained due to his undocumented status. He was pulled over for running a stop sign at school, and that led to his detention. Anna has a 6-month-old daughter. In addition to Cesar, and the partner's been detained for 4 months, so he's been gone for a lot of the daughter's life. Anna's a U.S. citizen, daughter of Mexican immigrants. Her partner is a Mexican citizen who lived in the U.S. for 15 years by the time of his detention. Anna and Cesar live in a predominantly Latino community in which immigration enforcement has become increasingly stringent. Government and law enforcement in the community are predominantly white. They kind of reflect what the community used to look like. And there's a lot of tension between newer Latino residents and kind of the older white residents and folks who tend to have power in the community. So that's the case, right? And again, on this one, we're going to choose our role. Lots of different potential roles. I might be a mental health provider working with mom. I might be a mental health provider working with the family. I might be a mental health provider working with Cesar, addressing the anxiety. I might be a school social worker working with Cesar, addressing the challenges he's having in schools. I might work in a meso capacity. I might be in a community agency that provides services, just general services to the Latino community there. I might be working on immigration policy broadly and become aware of this case. And so this case has relevance to my macro level work, but we're going to pick one. As I go through the different prompts, I'm going to kind of compare and contrast what a direct practice role, and let's say that I'm a mental health practitioner working with the son, with Cesar, how that might differ from kind of maybe a community practitioner, someone who might be working kind of with the whole Latino community in this state, or in this case. So competency 1 has to do with ethics, and you can read the prompt there, but you're really going to be either highlighting a potential ethical dilemma you might face, or a way in which kind of your personal values and professional values might come into conflict, and how you would make sure to resolve that, okay? So it's not, you haven't worked with this case, but you're going to envision something. So, in this case, immigration issues are really salient. A potential kind of ethical consideration is going to be, when mom brings Cesar and we're maybe exploring his anxiety, dad's immigration status is clearly a factor, right? The fact that he's detained is probably fairly related. And so I'm going to have to really think about how to ethically approach asking the family questions about immigration status and things like that, because there are definite implications, for asking those questions, both in the relationship, but also in terms of providing reassurance and safety and ensuring, that our clients are protected. So that might be a potential ethical dilemma. Perhaps if you're someone who grew up in a space where you had particular beliefs about people who are undocumented, and that's something that you've worked and you can certainly still put to the side, right? It's not something that's guiding your behavior, but it might be something you have to be aware of. And so you might talk about that conflict between those types of things. So you're going to highlight a potential ethical dilemma or conflict that could emerge, or something you would have to be particularly aware of, and how you would use the code of ethics to kind of guide your response to that dilemma or that conflict. In competency 2, you're going to talk about how diversity and difference kind of shape the experience of your clients. So again, how you frame the client is going to matter. If I am a mental health provider with Cesar, I'm going to talk about Cesar, his identity, right? Who he is, how his intersecting identities can lead to experiences of potentially privilege or marginalization, right? If I'm working with the community, I'm going to think of the community's identity, right? Who are they as a group? What experiences have they had as a group? And how do those things contribute to oppression or marginalization or privilege, right? And in this scene, or in this scenario, we have one kind of community group that seems to have some privilege and another that doesn't. We might talk about that. Okay? So again, different ways of framing it, your response is going to be different, but the same core concepts want to be covered. In competency 3, we want to be able to kind of broaden out the concern that we're working with into how do we understand it as a human rights, social justice, economic, or environmental justice issue. So when I think about Cesar, right? If I'm directly practicing with him, we're working on anxiety, but there's a bigger issue here. That has to do with families, right, who experience this type of separation as a result of immigration issues. That really is a human rights issue, so we might talk about that, right? When we're talking about the community, we're talking about maybe a whole group of people who are experiencing oppression, right, because of both maybe a combination of cultural, immigration status, language barriers, all of those things. So we might talk about how those barriers have served to marginalize that whole population, right? And what would we do to address that? Competency 4 has to do with practice-informed research and research-informed practice. So what we want to know here is, where would you go and how would you go about looking for evidence-based practice in this case, in this role you've chosen? So the first thing you're going to do is kind of say, where would I go to look? Right? What would you look for? Even what search terms would you use? What would you look for? And then you're going to find one recent peer-reviewed article or evidence-based practice guide. There's some great guides from things like SAMHSA that would be useful. So if I'm a direct practitioner working with Cesar, I might look at anxiety in children. I might look at evidence-based practice for children who have been separated from their parents due to immigration issues, or children in mixed status families. Those types of things could be all useful, right? And then I'd find one article that could really help inform my work with him. If I'm looking at the community level, right, we might look at work and that kind of guides what are best practices for working with immigrant communities. How do we ensure safety and voice, right, when we're working with these communities? We'd find that, and then we find one relevant article that would support that work. Okay? We're looking at policy practice. We're going to identify any kind of historical or social policy or services that impacts right, your client in this case, and what policy changes would you suggest, if any are necessary, or kind of how would you approach policy development. So in this case, if I'm a direct practitioner working with Cesar, clearly a number of immigration policies impact him, right? There might be immigration policies around driver's licenses that are relevant in terms of why dad was detained. There might be policies around whether or not people can be detained based on nonviolent offenses, or what detention looks like. Does it need to be, if someone is undergoing maybe an immigration legal proceeding, do they need to be detained in a jail, right? Or could they be detained in a different way at home where there's monitoring that would be more humane? Right? There's a lot of policies that are potentially at play there. So we might identify one of those. If we're looking at kind of the whole Latino community, we might look at policies relating to, accessing services and how immigration plays into that, or how language plays into that, and how might we influence policy in order to benefit, right, our clients. So, engagement. Here I want you to think about how are you going to build relationships with your client. And again, think about who you decided your client really is. So if we're working with Cesar in a direct practice setting, we might talk about strategies we use. We might do some play therapy or drawing. We might talk to him and mom and do some, work there. And then how would you kind of also be aware of yourself and your experiences and the influence that's going to have on the relationship. So, I might be thinking, here I am, I'm working with this kiddo. I'm a different race and ethnicity than this kiddo, right? And how can I kind of, maybe he's bilingual and I'm not. How do that influence the relationship? And how am I going to make sure to address any potential barriers to relationship building? Okay. Similarly on the community side, right? Maybe we're going to say, hey, we're going to have these pláticas, we're going to have town halls, right? We're going to use folks who are already involved in the community to help lead some of that work, and I'm going to attend them. And then we would also, again, identify how are those, those realities of who we are, how will they impact the relationship building, whether they're ways in which we're similar to our clients or ways in which we're different, whatever it is, how are we going to, make sure that who we are is not a barrier to relationship building. Assessment, we really want to look at kind of what is the process, how would you approach assessment, what information would you need to get, and how would you get it, okay? So if I'm looking at Cesar, I'm probably going to do some work to get to know him, right? And so I might do some kind of play-based assessment with him. I'd probably interview mom, right? Probably do some extensive kind of social history with mom to be able to kind of do a biopsychosocial with him. We might do some anxiety rating scales to kind of see how significant the concerns are right now. Those might be some tools. Then you're going to talk about a theory or theoretical framework, right? So I'm going to think about Cesar and his anxiety, this issue that's presenting, and I'm going to think about everything that's happening with him. And, I might choose systems theory, right, to explain what's going on, because, I'm not seeing his anxiety as a kind of behavioral problem. It's not maybe a psychoanalytic theory might not explain it, but it seems to me to be a direct response to what's happened with dad and maybe mom's anxiety as a result of that. And so systems theory might best explain what I'm seeing, right? One example. If we're looking at the kind of macro community level practice, assessment will look different, right? We might talk about doing focus groups, interviewing key stakeholders, doing a kind of community needs and assets map, right? That kind of work. So we would do those, and then we talk about a theoretical framework that would help us understand kind of, why is it that this particular community is feeling very marginalized or is very marginalized in comparison? And there you might look at kind of broader social theories to explain that. For intervention, then we're going to talk about, once you've identified this need from the assessment, what are you going to do about it? Excuse me. So with Cesar, we're talking about anxiety. I'm going to look at evidence-based intervention for kiddos with anxiety, and in particular, like maybe kiddos who have immigration-related processes going on that are impacting their anxiety, right? So here's what I would do. We'd do some play therapy. I might be able to find an article or something that's supporting that play therapy is useful, is evidence-based, and then I would talk about interprofessional or interorganizational practice. So for him, for Cesar, I might want to make sure that I'm able to involve the school in some way, even if I'm just sharing some thoughts on how they can best support him. Of course, with mom's consent to collaborate, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about interprofessional. Who else would you need to involve? If we're looking at the community level, our intervention might be something like the formation of a task force, right? Or the formation of a kind of community-driven project to give voice, right, to the Latino community. You'll have to think through what it would look like. And then when we think about interprofessional or interorganizational practice, we might think about what stakeholders would we need to involve, right? Would we involve law enforcement or healthcare providers? Or who are the key people that we need to help the community make connections with in order for things to improve? And the last competency is evaluation. So we want to know how you would evaluate outcomes from the interventions you described. So whatever it is you said you would do in competency 8, you want to go back to in competency 9 and say, here's how I would measure the outcome of that, right? Here's how I would expect, here's what I expect might happen, and here's how I would know. Here's the evidence I would use. So if I'm working directly with Cesar, we might want to redo his anxiety rating scale, right? I might want to kind of, on a weekly basis, gather data from Mom where she's kind of rating what she's seen over the course of the week, right? We might get his own feedback and do some goal attainment scaling. How good or how bad did you feel like your anxiety was that week? And over time, we might even get information from his teachers. And we'd use that to inform our decisions. If we're looking at the community level, we might look at things like how many Latino community members are utilizing services, right, from these particular providers or who are engaged in particular community events. And that might give us an information about how comfortable people are feeling and whether or not our actual intervention is working. What's important on 7, 8, and 9 is that we want to see clear alignment. So here's how I approach assessment. Here's the things I'm learning about, trying to figure out and understand, right? And that kind of identifies a need. And then how are we going to intervene to meet that need? They should clearly be aligned. And then the evaluation very often is actually going to go back to some of the data you collected during assessment. You might collect again, but at the minimum, it should be directly tied to your intervention, right? So as much as we can make sure those things are in a line, and as much as you can make sure that this entire paper really is targeted and reflected of that particular role for social work involvement that you chose, I think then you're going to be able to really clearly and thoroughly articulate all of your understanding of the competencies.